Greetings and salutations. Thank you for clicking on the video. It is a lovely, bright Sunday morning right now as I record this. November the 26th, 2017. I have coffee and I have a list of your questions that I have taken from email, Facebook, and YouTube. And I'm going to read them to you and then I'm going to answer those questions. Pretty cool concept, huh? It's called a Q&A, and it's the EzeeLinux Q&A episode 14. So here we go. Let's just jump right into it. First question comes from Andrew in Ontario, Canada. Do you think the LM team, meaning Linux Mint, will follow in Ubuntu's footsteps regarding the removal of a separate swap partition with a swap file? Would that switch also require a complete reinstall? Okay, so I'm not really sure what Linux Mint is intending to do, but we will certainly find out when Linux Mint 19 comes along, which will be midsummer 2018. Chances are they will follow in Ubuntu's footsteps. They usually do whatever Ubuntu does as far as plumbing issues like that are concerned. However, there is one thing that might make them change how Ubuntu does it, and that is the fact that the Cinnamon desktop and all of the implementations of other desktops that Linux Mint distributes, they offer Hibernate right up front. It's a button that you can click and it will hibernate the computer, which means save the current state and shut it down. And that works by using a swap partition. And so if they go to a swap file, that would mean that they would have to tweak the kernel. I know that. There's a kernel tweak that allows that to happen with a swap file, and then they will have to create a swap file that is as big as system memory, a little bit larger actually. I think one of the reasons that Ubuntu switched over to creating a swap file was that they could create small little files, kind of keep swap out of the way, because there's been a raging debate for years, people going on, do you really need swap? Is swap a good thing? How much swap should you give the system? Where should you put the swap partition? It's just this constant running thing. So the Ubuntu folks say, okay, we'll put it in a little swap file and we'll kind of hide it a little bit, and then we'll have the system decide what's the best size, and we'll just take care of it in the background, and maybe people will shut up about it. I think that's why they did it. So in the case of Ubuntu, if you have more than 8 gigabytes of memory in a machine, then it just creates a 2 gigabyte swap file, and that's it. Well, the Hibernate feature won't work with that. So it depends on whether Linux Mint wants to hang on to Hibernate or not. If they do, then they'll probably continue to create a swap partition. If they decide to do that, if they decide to go with a swap file instead of a swap partition, then there would be no change for somebody who would upgrade. The system would just go, oh, there's already swap space here, and it would continue to use the swap partition. So that wouldn't mean a reinstall would be necessary. However, if you did reinstall and you started from scratch, you formatted the hard drive, then it would just go ahead and create a swap file like Ubuntu does now. So I hope that answers your question. The main reason for having the swap on a separate partition is because in Unix and Linux, the early days there, if you'd had a machine, you would probably have several storage devices. And all of this about dividing up the system into different partitions, in Linux you can have a separate root partition, home partition, boot partition, temp partition, var partition, swap partition, is just to make efficient use of all of these different little devices that used to be hooked up to machines. These days, hard drives, number one, they're big, and number two, we're going into the world of SSD, and having all these different partitions doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you're talking about solid-state storage and you're talking about really big drives. So, I don't know. We'll see what happens. We'll see how that goes. More hard drive related questions. I love them. Keep them coming. So much fun. Where to put Ubuntu? Okay, I'm going to try and read through this, gang. This is one of those things that you read and it makes perfect sense, but when you actually read it out loud, you go, Louie, what's this guy talking about? It says, I will be purchasing a NUC 7 i5 BNH and am intending on install both on M2 SSD as the OS drive as well as a 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte 7200 or 6500 RPM respectively as a data drive. Ubuntu 17.10 will be the sole OS on the M2 SSD. I have no interest in running Windows. Well, good for you. And I have a MacBook Pro as my alternate OS. Well, it's better than Windows. My question revolves around capacity, specifically that of the M2 SSD. I have been considering at both 275 gigabytes and 525 gigabyte options, were I to store home on the data drive, I could probably get away with the 275 gigabyte M2 SSD. I've also read about putting everything on the M2 SSD, then creating directories on the data drive, and doing a symlink ln-s from the data drive to the OS to save space on the OS drive. And this question comes to us from Bud. All right. This is a dilemma that a lot of people face. You have a system where you're going to have 2 hard drives in it. And, of course, now you could... Probably the best option from a speed and efficiency point of view here would be to buy a really big SSD, like 512 gigabytes, and be done with it and put everything on that one SSD. But the little nut computers, they have the built-in M2 drive, and then they have the ability to stick a 2.5-inch drive in those machines. So I know exactly the form factor of the machine is kind of dictating what he's doing, which is still a good idea. So what I told him to do here is that he could get away with getting a much smaller SSD. If you are going to just use an SSD to install the slash partition, the system, and then you're going to separate the home partition to another drive, that drive can be really small. 32 gigabytes would be more than enough, and 64 gigabytes would almost be overkill. I think that what he ended up buying was 128 gigabytes to use for the system itself. And that is really overkill right there, because the system, especially with Ubuntu, it's going to take up about maybe 7 or 8 gigabytes. And that's after you install a bunch of software. But with an SSD, the less space you use, the longer it will last, because then the system can use its wear leveling to make sure that the drive has a lot of longevity and all that stuff. So it would still be a good idea. And I recommended that he get a hold of a Caviar Black Western Digital drive and use that for the home drive, 7200 RPM drive with a 32 gigabyte cache and dual processors in the drive. And those are really, really fast spinners. Nowhere near as fast as an SSD, but a whole heck of a lot faster than your regular 2.5-inch laptop drive for sure. And it's a more economic option if you do it that way. And so what he's going to do is he's going to put the root partition is going to go on 128 gigabyte SSD, and then he's going to separate his home partition onto the Caviar Black 1 terabyte drive, and that's how he's going to do it. Now, as far as him talking here about, yeah, you can take the whole system and stick it on one drive and then use symlinks to another storage device, I've looked at that. I've done that. I've done videos about that. I've showed people how to do it. And today I would never do it because it's just a big pain in the butt, because then you're sitting there chasing down where all the links are and how you're going to mount that other drive to the system and where it's going to appear in the system. And it really gets to be this big kind of thing. It's advanced, and it's also kind of a pain. What I like to do today is just keep it really simple. On a system like that, I would use one drive for the system and use the other drive for a home partition and be done with it and just keep on rocking down the highway. Now, really what's going to determine what you do with a system like that is cost, because in this case, he's probably paying, maybe $150 total for his storage at this point. And if he would have gone and gotten a 500 gigabyte SSD, which would give him half the space, then he'd probably still pay about $150. So it's, it would be really nice to have one of those little machines and then have a little M2 for your boot up, and then get a regular 2.5-inch form factor SSD and stick it in there, and then make that your home partition, and then everybody's all solid state and happy. But that's what he ended up doing, and it's very economical. He built this entire system, and this is not the whole thing. I mean, this question comes from a much longer conversation that we had, and what he ended up buying and putting together to build that little NUC is, he spent under $1,000 for it, and it's going to be a really awesome little system. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would do, is just keep it simple. I keep it simple these days as much as possible. And this is not necessarily a question here. It's a comment. And I thought that it was so well written and so pertinent that I would actually just read it to you in this video, and I would comment on it. How's that? I was in a pharmacy where one of your country folk was buying medicine for his headache. The shop assistant offered a heron packet. Here the customer began what became a cascade of agitation. Panadol, I ventured. The customer was quaking. The shop assistant said that it was paracetamol. Well, the customer lost more composure. Acetaminophen, I'd offered. It was only when I said Tylenol that he relaxed. I mean that corporations and brands differ across national boundaries. You and your server-oriented friend, and he's talking about Jeremy O'Connell when he was watching one of the Mr. Server and Mr. Desktop videos, kept mentioning corporations and brands that don't exist here. My cable transport and ISP company is iNet from Perth, Western Australia, which has taken over the Transact Government Private Amalgam of Canberra, in which latter name my bills get issued. Please consider how your local familiarization will be received in Manchester, UK, New Delhi, India, etc. And that comes from Brian. And that just brings up all kinds of really cool points to talk about there. Yes, when me and when I do a video, I try very hard to keep them generic. I don't talk about things that are local to me unless I think somebody in New Delhi, India, or the UK or Canberra, Australia would find some way to identify with them. And I do try and keep things as plain as possible, just simply because of the fact I know that people are all over the world going to be watching these. And if I start talking about things that are local to where I live and start talking about stuff like that, then people will get lost. Now, when we were doing the Mr. Server and Mr. Desktop series, that's a little bit different because I can't control what a guest talks about. And so it's just, we go back and forth on it. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that we are all creatures of our own environment. And honestly, if I sat around worrying about whether people in New Delhi or Canberra would get everything that I said, I probably wouldn't do a video. And the reason why is because I don't know what your cable company is. I don't know what your ISP is. I don't know, what brands of stuff you're going to find at the pharmacy. But I just kind of, move along here. It's not necessarily that I am being callous to other cultures and other situations around the world. It's just I'm ignorant. I don't live there. I don't know, so I don't talk about it. I can only talk about what I know and try and relate it as best as possible. And so, therefore, I try to be very magnanimous about that sort of thing. So you got to understand that, I watch a lot of videos from people overseas as well. And in some videos, I get what they're talking about, and in others, I don't. I just have no idea. Sometimes people say things, and I go, I don't know what that is. But then I keep in mind that I don't live there. So, therefore, it becomes one of those kind of deals. I mean, you can either adapt or you can't. And it really comes down to personality, which is why I thought the little story about being in the pharmacy there where the guy was looking for headache medicine, and the only brand he knew was Tylenol, which is an American brand. And, Panadol, he didn't know what that was, but it's the same thing. That's kind of what happens to people when they start with Linux. It really is, especially Windows power users who are so used to being like, I can do anything with this system. I can make it do whatever I want to do. Well, you sit them down in front of a Linux system, and then they get lost and they start to panic. And then when they get very upset that they might have to learn something. And this is when they lash out at Linux and go, oh, Linux sucks. Everything is blah, 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 blah. Well, it's not that Linux is bad. It's that Linux is different. And it's the same deal with our friend over here who was in Australia looking for headache medicine. Did he really expect to walk into a store on the other side of the planet and have everything be the way that he's used to? And is it the fault of the person in the store or the fella at the counter trying to help him? No, it's absolutely not. But yet, if you go through the forums, you're going to find people who load up Linux that have run Windows for years and they go, oh, this sucks. It's not. No, it's not. It's just different, folks. That's all there is to it. It's a very interesting thing to point out here. And yes, I do try and consider that. And I can do it to a certain point, I guess is the point of my answer directly to what Brian said. I think that's what I said in my email to him, is that, yeah, we're all kind of we're all creatures of our environments, and it's just kind of the way it is. And to be quite honest, I'm surprised at how many people around the world watch these videos and follow these videos. And I get a lot of people in Europe who say that English is not their first language, who say, well, I can understand what you're saying, and that's a big compliment. So thank you. I'm glad that other people around the world can watch it, and that so many people from all over the world watch these videos. It's a very humbling experience for me, extremely humbling to think that when I post one of these videos, somebody in Australia is watching, or Canada, or anywhere that these videos are available, because people do watch them all over the world. I talk to people from everywhere, which is an amazing thing. And so, that's one of the reasons in my videos I never say anything about politics. I don't talk about current events. I don't talk about things going on here in the United States unless they're huge and they're major and would affect something that has to do with a video. But, people don't care if you're watching in Mumbai. It makes no difference to you. So, anyway, very interesting subject to talk about. And thank you for the well-worded comment, Brian. Very much so. We're going to talk about those troublesome SSDs again. And I got actually 2 SSD questions that I'm going to answer at once, because lately it seems that I get this question about 3 times a week. So I've actually featured 2 of them. First one comes from Rich. He says, where do I find directions to set up Ubuntu with an SSD? Anything special needs to be done? Number 2, could you please make a video about what needs to be done during and after a Linux installation, Linux Mint, on an SSD drive so that the system works fine and the drive doesn't bork? I've read some things about that and watched some videos, but I would like to hear your take on that. Thank you for helping us noobs. And that's from Christo. Thank you for the very nice question there, Christo. I appreciate it. Okay, first thing, you don't need to do anything at all to Ubuntu or Linux Mint, any current version of Ubuntu or Linux Mint, if you have an SSD. It will take care of it for you. It is set up to do that. There is, first of all, the installer will note the fact that you have an SSD, and when it creates partitions on that disk, it will make sure that they're aligned properly. So that's the first thing that it does. The second thing that it does is it actually modifies some really deep down stuff in the ext4 file system and how the kernel writes and the order in which things get written to the disk to make sure that it's performing up to the standard that an SSD needs. And then it also has the trim function that runs once a week. That will be activated. The system will know it's an SSD, and that function will just take off and run once a week. And so therefore that's something that you never have to worry about. You do not have to go into your FS tab and set discard. You do not have to change anything in your FS tab as far as options for your system, like activating no A time and all this other stuff. Don't do it. Let the system take care of it. It will do it, and it'll be just fine. There is a huge amount of information out there about SSDs. A lot of it is very old. A lot of it is myth. And a lot of it is paranoia, where people are going, every time that you write something to your disk, you're killing it, that sort of stuff. I did a couple of videos about that a while back, about how the paranoia gets in your head. I used to run SSDs on this system, and or on one of my systems, and I was always like paranoid every time that I would hit save on a file. I'd be like, I'm killing my SSD. No, no, no. They're pretty robust, and with normal use, they'll probably outlast the rest of the computer. So, I mean, that's something not to worry about. And as far as things like, oh, don't put swap on there, and don't enable hibernation and all this other garbage that you read about, it's paranoia at this point. The SSDs that are being produced and shipped out in computers, I mean, you're talking about like M2 drives and the 2.5-inch SATA SSDs that are available for desktops and laptops, those sorts of things. They're robust. They're going to last a long time, and you don't need to worry about stuff like that. And Ubuntu and Linux Mint both take care of that right out of the box. I know that the last time that I looked at it, that in Arch Linux you had to activate a systemd timer to make that work. I don't know how OpenSUSE deals with it. I don't know how other distributions deal with it, but for Ubuntu and Linux Mint, it's already taken care of. And by the way, going in there and changing anything manually, adding something to the FS tab would probably just mess up what's already in place. So don't do it. Just leave it alone. It'll take care of itself, and your little SSD will be happy and healthy for a very long time. Unless you do with SSDs like I did, which was like, I reloaded them like, once a week. And then would bang them around from computer to computer because I was constantly moving stuff around. So I ended up killing a few myself. If I'd have left them alone, they'd probably still be running today. I had an Intel and an OCZ SSD that I used to play around with and kind of beat them up. These days I have moved into using server-grade spinning drives. Like right now I've got a Western Digital 10,000 RPM Velociraptor in this machine, and Western Digital Caviar Black 7200 RPM drive. And that's what I use because I kind of killed all my SSDs. So I'm going to keep using these as long as they last, of course, especially the 10,000 RPM drives. And when that comes along, I'll be switching to SSD. Linux for the blind. This is a question that I get quite often, and this comes from Yvonne. He says, do you have any input on Linux for the visually impaired or blind people? I have several friends who used Windows with JAWS and want to try Linux. Well, okay, look, I don't know a great deal about this, and I get asked this question a lot. I do know that Linux Mint and is probably one of the better distributions to work with if you are visually impaired. If you are completely blind, I don't know how that would stack up against using a Windows system with JAWS on it. I really couldn't tell you. But what I can tell you is that there's more work that needs to be done right now in the Linux world for folks who are blind or visually impaired, especially people who are totally blind. Visually impaired, you're good to go. There's a magnifier in here. There's all kinds of ways. You can high contrast themes. There's things that you can do to make this very visible and easy to see. That I can identify with much more because of my own eye conditions. And so, therefore, that I've actually looked into. As far as the screen reader is concerned, I'm not qualified to be able to tell you how good it is compared to other solutions. What I would like to see is that there would be more attention paid to this in the Linux world, because as Linux becomes more and more of a mainstream choice for desktops, more folks who need to have a computer that is designed for somebody who is, has no sight at all to be able to navigate. They're going to need this, and I think more attention needs to be paid to it. So if you guys are watching this out there, raise awareness about it, and kind of you might want to look around for yourself, and if this is something that's important to you, you might want to let the developers know. I think it's pretty much a matter of the projects being able to find people who can specialize in doing this. And I know that Linux Mint, for instance, has one fellow there who is visually impaired, which is one of the reasons that the Linux Mint, the Cinnamon desktop in particular, is very nice for people who need things nice and big on the screen. And believe me, I take advantage of those things all the time myself. So I appreciate that. It's one of the reasons I like Cinnamon. So yeah, great comment, great question. And for right now, I have to answer. I just don't know. I mean, this is not something that I'm, really into. I hear bits and pieces about it every now and again. I wish that there was more. I think what would be nice is to have a Linux distro somewhere that is specifically designed for people who need that. I mean, in Linux, we can do that. In Windows or Mac, you're just adding on to it to make it work. But in Linux, we could have a distribution that would be specifically designed for somebody who needed those sorts of things. And that would be cool. So, let's see. This question is about a 32-bit system. It says, I'm having problems with Mint XFCE 32-bit Sonia after installation. I boot from USB and everything is okay. I install it and everything works fine as long as I don't shut down the system. When I shut it down, remove the USB drive and restart, booting from main drive, it hangs at Linux Mint logo. It's a Dell Inspiron Mini 101 or 1018 Intel Atom 1.6 gigahertz with 1 gigabyte of RAM and 120 gigabyte SSD. Any idea of what is going wrong? I have asked in the Mint forum, but the answers they are giving me are too sophisticated. I'm not that geeky. Thank you very much. And that question comes from Lewis. By the way, the question, I don't know whether I said the thing about the computer for the Linux for the blind there comes from Yvonne. This is a great question. I didn't know whether I gave him credit, and I wanted to do that. I realize it's a little thing, but some people just listen to these videos and don't look at the screen, so I wanted to make sure I did that. Anyway, back to Lewis's question here. Okay, what I'm pretty sure is going on in this situation is the fact that for whatever reason, he's trying to load a 32-bit operating system on a 64-bit machine. See, I looked it up. And usually when people ask these questions, I do what they should have done from the start. And I'm not trying to say that to be nasty. It's just if you do a search that starts with installing Linux on, and then put in Dell Inspiron Mini 1018 Intel Atom, and it's all you got to do, all of this stuff comes up. Because usually there's other people out there who have tried to install Linux on these machines. And according to everything that I read, there should be absolutely no issue whatsoever with Linux Mint running on a machine like that. The one thing that's different here is that you're trying to put a 32-bit system on a 64-bit machine. And this sometimes works and sometimes doesn't these days. And so my advice to Lewis was to download the 64-bit version and install that. And I'll bet you anything that it worked. What happened here, what's going on here is that people will read on the internet that there's a... Okay, let's just rewind the clock about 10 years ago. About 10 years ago was when the switch to 64-bit was still going on. So any time between the early 2000s and about 2010, we were still in the process of getting everything ready in the Linux world for a 64-bit system. And the general knowledge of how to deal with that back then is that 2008, 2009, people were saying, well, it doesn't matter whether you have a 64-bit system. If you have such and such amount of RAM, go ahead and install 32-bit. It's more stable than 64-bit. Unfortunately, nothing gets deleted from the internet, and that could be with today's computers, that could be, there's nothing further from the truth, especially with the way Linux has progressed, is that now you want a 64-bit system and only use 32-bit if you absolutely positively have to. 32-bit is being phased out. Ubuntu is dropping 32-bit. Arch Linux dropped 32-bit. 32-bit is going away, and I say goodbye and good luck and see you later, because it's caused a lot of confusion over the years, like in this particular situation. I'm sure that they looked at this and said, somebody somewhere said that, okay, well, for that system, it's an Atom processor and it's 1 gigabyte of RAM. Just use a 32-bit version. And that can get you into trouble right now because of the fact that the 32-bit stuff, it has some compatibility issues at this point. So unless you're installing it on a system like an Intel Celeron or something like that that absolutely needs 32-bit, like I'm talking about an old Celeron, not a modern Celeron. I just got a computer the other day that has a Celeron processor in it. Takes 64-bit. Most any computer that was manufactured in the last 10 years has a 64-bit processor in it at this point. I know that there's a couple of exceptions out there, especially when you're dealing with the netbooks, but we don't need to be worrying about 32-bit systems unless you have a specific need for a 32-bit system because you're trying to run Linux on a 10 or 15-year-old computer with a single core 32-bit processor in it. And if that's the case, then Linux Lite offers 32-bit still. I mean, it's still out there, it still exists, but I would guess that within 3 to 5 years, you're going to be very hard-pressed to find any 32-bit operating systems out there at all, just simply because the industry has shifted. And it's like we are in the process of a shift right now from SSD, or rather from hard drives to SSDs in machines. When the cost starts coming down, then you're going to see fewer machines shipped with actual hard drives in them, and they're going to have like M2 motherboard based SSDs, or like this eMMC where it's a little SD card on cheaper devices like that little laptop that I just got. We're not going to see the spinning drives and systems anymore. We're changing. Well, the same thing's happening. 32-bit, this transition has gone on for like 10 years now. It's about done. 32-bit must die, make it go away so we don't have to deal with it anymore. Unless you know for sure that the machine that you're using, I mean, you're 100% sure that that's a 32-bit chip in there, start with 64. Don't use 32. It causes problems. So there's your answer, Lewis. And I'm pretty sure that, as I said install a 64-bit. Probably works just fine. I haven't heard back from Lewis yet to make 100% sure, but I almost can guarantee 99.8% that the problem there was trying to put a 32-bit system on a 64-bit machine, and there was a driver incompatibility, probably with the video card, and that's why it wasn't going to load. So anyway, there you go. All right, gang, thank you for watching the video, listening to me ramble on and answer questions. I hope I made sense. I hope I didn't, go off too far into left field, and I hope you got something out of it as well. And we do these every now and again when I collect enough of these to make it worth talking about. Your comments and suggestions and feedback are always welcome. And there are so many different ways that you can give me those comments and suggestions and feedback. We've got comments here on YouTube. Also, you can check out EzeeLinux on the web, and there you will find that there is a contact page and you can get a hold of me directly. Also, check out EzeeLinux on Facebook if you are a Facebook user, and a lot of people talk to me through there. We have a direct connection there, and unlike other Facebook quote-unquote business pages, this one is interactive. You can post comments and you can get involved with what we talk about there, and pretty much everything that comes up that has to do with EzeeLinux in one way or the other will show up on that page. There is one thing I do want to say down here at the end of the video. I probably should have said it up front, is that I'm getting a lot of questions from people who are asking me what's wrong with their computer, and then they're not giving me any information to work with at all. So if you say Linux Mint won't boot on my computer, it doesn't help me. First of all, I don't know what version of Linux Mint you're running, and I really need to know what machine that you are using this on. So those are the two things that are really important. Your distribution, the exact version of that distribution, and what hardware you're working on, and I'll try and point you in the right direction if I can. But there's a lot of, I'm getting a lot of things where it's like one sentence. Somebody's just saying, Linux Mint doesn't boot for me. Well, I'm sorry, but you're not telling me anything. Somebody sent me a thing the other day, and it said that the Linux Mint was not working when it would go for updates, and it was giving them an error. And I posted back, what error? I mean, if you don't tell me what the error is, how am I supposed to help? And I never heard another word. It's like, okay. And I'm pretty sure I know what that was, and it probably fixed itself before they got my response. So that's why I never heard anything. Sometimes Linux Mint, if it doesn't get to its mirrors that you've set up for it for whatever reason, it'll throw a big error on the thing and say, oh, the mirrors don't work, change them. And a lot of times if you just shut it down or just close that window and walk away from it and come back a few hours later, it's working fine. So that's one that I get all the time is, oh my God, Linux Mint can't get a hold of the mirrors, and the system's broken, I need to fix it. No, you don't. The mirror's down. It'll be back. Don't worry about it. Anyway, I'm done. Thank you for watching the video. We'll do it again soon.